All right, guys. This is going to be a lesson on the tools in Illustrator. We're going to try to get this as fast as possible. There's quite a bit to go over, so bear with me and pay attention, please. So we are using Illustrator, okay? And Illustrator is a different program than Photoshop, and they are very fundamentally different softwares in terms of how they do graphics. Photoshop is a raster-based system, okay? And Illustrator is a vector-based system. So what's the difference? And it's basically going to be about how they choose to show something, okay? So raster-based means pixels. So if we zoom into this A, as you can see, this A has a bunch of pixels, okay? It uses black, green, gray, and no matter what, no matter how big you make this or how you stretch it, it's going to use pixels to demonstrate that, okay? Vector, on the other hand, doesn't use pixels, it uses math. It uses vector points in space, and it's going to calculate where the shape is going to be in that space, and it's going to change the distance between those points based on how large or how small or where you've placed it in the coordinates. So if we zoom in on this, as infinite, as close as we can get, there's never going to be pixels. And that's because Illustrator won't let there be pixels because it's calculating for us the distance between those points, and it's going to create a nice, crisp, clean line for us. The benefit of this is that you can make very, very, very large graphics. So if you want to make a poster that is like the size of a house, you totally can, and all the graphics that are in there will be nice and crisp and clean. It's also really nice for letters, for fonts, because they won't lose any of their clarity. And so this is really important for legibility and readability, which comes into hand with print and stuff like that. So fundamentally, Illustrator is a vector-based graphics form, and so there's a couple things that we have to pay attention to when we're using vector graphics. One of those is that there's a difference between lines and shapes in this, and this is how Illustrator likes to show all their stuff. They use lines and shapes. Now, these two things, they look the same, right? This looks like a line, that looks like a line, but Illustrator uses different ways to show this, okay? So if I click on this is a line. Okay, if we get close to it, you can see, just like how I said, there's a point on one end and a point on another. And if you guys remember your math, this is called a line segment, and these are called points, right? So these are also called vectors. So one point here and one point here. If I grab this object, it'll move everything. If I grab just one of the points, it'll move the whole line, right? So even though this is thick, it's one single line, and Illustrator just recognizes the line segment. This, on the other hand, is a shape. You can take this line and you can actually make it into a shape. And the reason it's a shape is because it actually has vector points on all of the outsides of this thing. So if I grab a vector point here and I manipulate it, you can see that the other 3 points stay where they are. So we can see things that look very similar, and they're very different according to Illustrator, okay? So this is something that I want you guys to pay attention to, because you can get easily confused. You can be building something that you think is a shape, but it's actually just a bunch of lines that are not connected to each other. And then you're like, why is this feature that I'm trying to use not working? That's because Illustrator needs there to be shapes for a lot of this stuff to work. So you try to build things with lines, like if you try to draw or you try to paint and you're using a line tool to do that, and you're like, man, why can't I use these features? It's because Illustrator doesn't recognize this as something that can be manipulated the way that this does. All of the fun features we're going to use are going to require you guys to have shapes, all right? Some things that we use that are cool are going to be used in lines, but lines make up shapes, and we need those to be distinct. So another distinction that we make is that there's something called stroke and fill. So both of these have the same lines inside of them, okay? This is just a box, and that's just a box. 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, and then 4 vectors. If I go to the different corners, they're the exact same thing, but they look different because we use something called stroke and fill. So the stroke is the thickness of the line. Remember how we talked about how this is a line? The reason this looks like a shape is because I've made the line thicker, and we can actually reduce the thickness of that line, so it gets much thinner, to almost 0. We can make it much thicker, so it's really, really big and almost looks like a rectangle. Okay? So that's what this is here. This is just the same thing. It's a stroke. I can make it thicker. I can make it thinner. Okay? Over here is the fill. This is the inside of the square. This doesn't have a stroke. I have turned it off. And if you look over here, this doesn't have a fill. I've turned it off. you can actually go over here on this one that has the stroke, and you can go into the fill, and you can go find a color, and you can fill it. And so now it has a stroke and a fill. And you can also manipulate the line on the outside so it's a little different. We can go back in. If I click on this over here, there's a little white square with a red line through it that says none. You can get rid of the fill there, so now it's just a stroke again. And likewise, I can go to the stroke, and I can go turn on the stroke. I can go make it thicker, thinner over here, likewise. So just keep that in mind. There's a difference between stroke and fill. These lines on the outside of these shapes can be manipulated in their own way. All right? So let's start talking about tools, specific tools. I'm going to try to get through this as fast as we can. We have two different ways to select. In Photoshop, we had just a selection tool. In Illustrator, we have the selection and direct selection. So selection tool, if I hover over an object, it's going to give me a little black bar that says, hey, this is something that I can select. You can go ahead and grab that. So I'm going to grab it. I got it now. So I can grab it, manipulate it, move it around. Okay. If I go over here, this selection tool is telling me that there's nothing to grab. And if I go into the stroke, you can see there's also nothing to grab. It's not until I get actually to the line that a little dot appears that says I can grab something. If I click, you can see that's the line for the shape there. So keep that. If you're like, why can't I select this thing? It's probably because you don't have the line selected. Just to make it easy for yourself, instead of having to go and find that little dot when you want to select something, just click and drag over an area you want to select and let go, and it'll select it for you. But now you want to move this line, you can't. If I go in and kind of keep trying to do this, if I select it and still try to drag, it's not going to move it. So I have to select it and then hover over it until I get that little black bar that or black box underneath that says I'm allowed to move something. I can click it and then move it. Okay. Likewise goes for this. I can select this, and then it'll give me a little black box that says you can move this as well. Now the direct selection tool is different because just like how this can grab large objects, the direct selection tool grabs small objects. And small objects are going to be the specific points of our objects here, or yeah, our shapes and lines. So the vectors, we can grab the vectors with the selection tool, and I can grab a vector and manipulate it independently from the rest of the shape. Okay. I can also grab the shape with this, but I get a lot more control. I can actually grab individual parts. Okay. Now, you can't transform the whole shape with the direct selection tool. I can't make this whole shape smaller or larger. I can't stretch it or squash it. That's what the selection tool is for. So you can see I can switch between these really quickly. V is the selection tool, A is the direct selection tool. So I can squash and stretch this, I can rotate it, and then I can go switch over to the selection tool, and I can go and grab one of these vectors and manipulate it and kind of play around with the shapes and mess with them. Okay, so this is how you're going to manipulate things. Next thing is the wand. It's just one down lower. If you click on it, what it does is it lets you select things that look similar. Say if I want to select just this box here with the selection tool, it only lets me select the box. But if I want to select everything that's orange, I can select with the magic wand tool, and as you can see, everything that's orange here is now selected, and I can go and grab and manipulate all of them at the same time. Here's a lasso tool. Let's say I want to select, a few things here. I can select and drag, and I can select multiple objects. You can see this little blue box there that says I've selected them, and it creates a bounding box between all of them. But what if I just want to select this one, this one, this one, and this one? If I try to drag and select here, I'm going to accidentally select a few other things that I don't want to do. So if you want to get really specific, you can go over here to the lasso tool, and then you can go and grab just the things you want, and then now I have just these 4 things selected, and I can manipulate them in any way. Okay? Now we have the pen tool. This is going to take a little bit of time because the pen tool is very important for Illustrator. So the pen tool is one down below. It's right here. It's P. And what this does is it creates vectors. So I click and creates a vector, and then it's giving me a line. And then if I click again, it creates a line segment for me. And as you can see, it's telling me that it wants to do more. It's like, where's the next line going to go? If you hit V while you're in the pen tool, it'll stop trying to create another line, and it just creates a line segment for you. And then this is manipulatable, just like the other ones was. You can go back over here, and you can add a stroke to it, and so on and so forth. But let's say I want to make a shape out of this. I've made something. Let's make a triangle. Okay, so I'm going to go over back to P. I'm going to hover over. You see the little asterisk on the bottom? That's saying like, cool, let's put down a vector. If I click on an existing vector, it's going to add to it. And so now I have a vector connected to this line segment, and then I can create a continuation. But as you can see here, it's telling me this looks like a shape, right? And this is something that a lot of people will accidentally do. They'll make 2 line segments, And the fill option will fill in the in-between between those line segments, and it'll look like a shape. So if I take off the stroke, if I get rid of it, you're going to see a triangle, and this looks like a shape. Okay, if I click on the middle of it, it's going to select everything, and that's because it understands like, hey, you want to select this whole thing, but it's not actually a shape. And so if I try to use some of the features that we talk about soon, it's not going to react the way I want it to. Okay, so if I go and turn the stroke back on, you guys can see it's just 2 line segments with a fill in between. If I take the fill out, you can see it's just 2 line segments. So we have to create shapes that are closed, and to do that, we have to go to an existing vector and then go to the last vector that's not open, or that's not closed. So I go over to it and I hover, and then as you can see, there's a little circle that appears on the bottom right of the cursor. If I click on that, it's going to close it off, and now we actually have a shape. And I can manipulate it and do all the cool stuff I'm about to show you guys. Okay. We can also use it to create curves. So if I can click, create multiple little dots on this area, I can create this interesting shape, but I want this to be curved. So one thing I can do is if you click and drag, it's going to create these little tails that tell you the direction that the line is going to go, but you can give it a different direction. And so you can see it creates a curve. And if I click again and drag, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to create a nice curve. I can really mess with the direction that the curve goes, and I can continue going and make this really interesting shape. Okay. Now you can also, if you click with the direct selection tool on these, you can see that we have those little tails are still visible. You can grab those tails and you can manipulate them after we've already done it. You can push them, make them smaller. You can also, if you hold Alt while you're doing this, manipulate just one of those, so it's not doing both the tails, and you can create cut-ins and do these really cool looking sharp points and so on and so forth. So lots of cool things you can do with this. This is where you guys are going to get most of your awesome work and effects from, is using the pen tool. All right, text tool. Text tool is much better here in Illustrator than it is Photoshop. This was made for text. So if you guys hit T for text, you guys can click on a text box. You can also click and drag to make a text box, and it'll automatically fill it in with some stuff. If you guys go over here to the properties panel, you can see that there is a change in the properties panel. Like if we look at it here, there's nothing going on right now. But if I click on this, you'll see character, paragraph, area type, bullets and numbering, and a line show up. And these are new contextual features that'll fill in because it knows what you're trying to do. So I can create a little text box. I can grab one, okay, and then I can go over here. I can pick a font. I got to make sure it's small enough to read, so I can start typing some stuff in. If you guys have used a word processor, which all of you have, you're in high school, you probably would know. This works just like a word processor. You can change the different types of fonts that we have. You can go to all the different ones that we have in live, see what they look like. You guys can change where it's centered, either in the middle of your text box or on the left. You can go up and down towards the middle, the side. You can spread their text to be, so like let's say you have 2 lines of text and I want it to be the top and bottom of this box, you can. You can have it lined up to the bottom, you can have it lined to the middle, or to the top. Okay. So yeah, this is very simple, very basic. There's a couple things in here that are really complicated we can talk about. These are old ways to manipulate things. So you can change something called the kerning, which is the distance between letters, the leading, and the tracking, and we'll go over these later when we actually do some more text stuff. But yeah, so that's text. So lines and shapes, we have tools that create lines and shapes. So we have a line segment tool. So if you want to just create a line segment without actually drawing the points, you can. You can create a bunch of line segments. But this is dangerous because now you have a bunch of line segments that don't do much. And then you have shape tools. If you hover over them, just like in Photoshop, we can create shapes. You can grab this and you can grow and blow up and make a whole bunch of cool little shapes. Now, this is where you guys are going to get confused because we have a paint tool and a blob paint tool. You guys be like, oh, the paint tool, just like in Photoshop. This is nothing like the Photoshop paint tool, okay? So if we go over to it, to the paintbrush tool, what this is going to do is it's going to paint you a line segment that's curved. So if I go and select this, you guys can see it is just a line segment with a bunch of points. What's really cool is that these points are editable, just like a shape would be. So I can go and manipulate them using the direct select. But it's made a line, it doesn't make shapes, okay? So you guys aren't going to be painting with lines, you're going to be painting or with shapes, you're going to be painting with lines, and then you're going to want to try to manipulate things. It's not going to do it. So what you're looking for is the blob brush tool, and this paints shapes. So if we go and click on it, as you can see here, it's made up of a bunch of lines that are connected so they make a nice uniform shape. Okay, so now you can actually get in there and start painting things that you're going for. And what's nice too is that if you paint over stuff with the blob tool, it creates it makes one large shape. Okay, you can also use the brackets to make your brush smaller. Okay, and this is all one large shape now. You can also use the shaper tool if you guys don't want to like work hard to build something. You can go grab the shaper tool and you want to draw over something. Like I want to create this hexagon. You can just kind of roughly draw a hexagon, and then Illustrator's gonna be like, cool, I know what you want, and it'll make it for you. You can do this with all kinds of stuff. You can do it with a circle, an oval. You can do it with a square, rectangle, and it's very quick ways to draw stuff. The eraser tool, I put a V eraser, that's not a V eraser. So the eraser tool is really cool because you can take, this is one of those things that if you don't have a shape, this isn't going to work. Okay, so if I go to the eraser tool, I can actually go in and carve into these shapes, and it'll create really interesting shapes for you. So as you can see, these now have vectors in between them, and I can manipulate these vectors. I can grab whole segments and kind of pull them out, and it gives you a lot of fun options to be able to manipulate stuff. So rotate and scale. So you can, of course, with the selection tool, you can change the scale of stuff. You can, mess with the actual shape orientation. You can rotate things by going on the corner and dragging. If you hold shift, it'll do it incrementally, so it's nice and clean. But you can also have a lot more control over that. So if we go over here underneath the eraser tool, you can go and click on an object and say, I want this one here, and I want to rotate it around the circle. So I'm going to go click on this. I'm going to click in the middle of the circle, and if I drag, now I can rotate the square on that. So you have a lot more control over how you rotate things. This is important if you really want precision. Okay, you might not use this very much, but this is a nice, cool thing to do. We can also do the same thing with scale. So let's say I want this to be scaled based on that point. I can scale everything according to the relative size of that area. Okay, so you can find use for this in any way. Figure out a fun, creative way to do this. But I'm just dragging and pushing around, and as you can see, it's manipulating it and changing it. Warp and transform. So there's all kinds of cool things here we can do. So change scale, warp and transform. There's lots of different warps in here. If you click over here, it's just underneath that scale change tool. The warp tool lets you go in, and it's kind of laggy. I'm kind of concerned about your guys' computers if you're going to be able to do this or not. But this will let you push vector points around. Okay. Yeah, even my computer, I have a 4070 RTX 4070, and even my computer doesn't like this. So be very careful with these tools. They do some really neat things though. They let you pucker. It's like pulling all of the different tools together, so you can kind of drag and play with how they go. And it creates new vector points every time you do this. We can bloat areas, like you can go and kind of hover over a section and it'll push it away or pull it in. This one's really cool, the swirl tool. You can grab a little section and it'll kind of bend it, swirl it for you. And then you can do crystals. We can crystallize sections so it kind of sharpens everything. Makes it look like water splatter or something. But yeah, and then also like the free transform tool. So you can grab things now, and I can specifically control how I want to do things. Especially if you hold control while you do it, you can get really good control. So this is just an easy tool access to the transform tool. All right, shaper tool. Shaper tool is really easy. Let's say I want this to be one big shape. I can select all of them. I go over to the shaper tool, which is right under here underneath the free transform. And if I click inside the first object that I want to connect to, and I drag it into these different shapes, it'll combine them all. So now I have one big shape. Mesh. Mesh is really cool because it gives you a lot of control. It's right underneath this one here. This is the perspective grid tool. We'll talk about that later. But this is the mesh tool. It's you. If you click on it, you can draw meshes. And this is really useful for if you guys want to add little bits on your shape that you can kind of cut out and push in. And like I said, it's just another way to get interesting control over what you've got going on. This is really useful for when you guys have a gradient. And if we go over to the gradient tool, which is now just underneath the mesh, if we click on this and we choose a gradient type up here, click on the gradient tool, click the gradient type over here. For some reason it's not working. What's going on? Yes, gradient. Work. Interesting. Let's see, let's try it. Maybe it's not working on that part for some reason. Okay, we click here, click here. Okay, so that one's working. So this is the gradient tool. This lets you create a gradient between two different values or colors, or you can actually do multiples. I can click on this line here, double click on this. It'll open up your the actual gradient options. See this little dot right here? And you can go and pick different colors, and you can have a whole bunch of different stuff going on. You can change the type of gradient, so it can be radial. You can have it coming from the center and going out. Okay, you can adjust where the gradient transitions from. You can change the shape, the size, the distance, all kinds of stuff. And so you should be able to do it on here. I wonder if there's a selection, like a setting that I have set up that's not letting me do it. I don't know why it's not letting me work on that. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll get this figured out for you guys. But yeah, you can use the mesh and the gradient in conjunction. It's really important to be able to do that. But anyways, this is a really fun one too. This is called the blend tool. So I can take this shape here and I can blend it in with this shape here. I have to select both of them. And then I go over here and you can see this little shape. See the blend? If I click on it and I click and drag where I want it to go, it'll create shapes in between them that blend into them. Now right now it's incremental. There's only a few different pieces in between them. But if I go up to Object, Blend, and Blend Options, if I make sure I'm in specified steps and I go over to this and I go to like say something like 200 and I hit OK, now I get this nice clean transition between these two pieces. And what's really cool is you can move these too. I can move this whole shape and it'll maintain the neat transition between them. I can also manipulate the shape, and once again it'll keep that neat transition and it'll adjust it as it's going too, live. So if I want to, I can grab this and really mess with it and get something really funky going on. Okay. And then the last one we're going to talk about is the symbol sprayer. This one you're going to have to go up to Window. You're going to have to go to Symbols. It's going to show a symbol window here, and you can always download and create new symbols. I'll show you guys how to do that later too. So let's see, vector grime, and I go over here and I can spray and it'll make a grime, lots of it. And as you can see, as you do it, it's creating vector shapes and it's pushing them around so that they fill in your area. What's nice too is that after you've made it, you can manipulate it, you can make it smaller, place it where you want it to be, adjust it. You can also expand it. So if you go to Object, Expand, and you say Object Fill, hit OK. Now they're all individual little pieces that you can pull out and manipulate. Okay, let's try a different one. There's a prettier looking stuff to spray. Let's go to this one. Okay. You change the size of your brush, you can make smaller ones. It'll only work if you start off a certain one, but yeah. So this is a really cool thing. So one thing you can do, this is a cool little technique, is if you select two different shapes, the one that's on the top is going to be a frame. So I'm going to take this, right click the shape, I'm going to go to Arrange, Bring to Front, so now it's in front of this thing. I'm going to select them both, and then I'm going to right click and I'm going to say Make Clipping Mask. And then now I've got my pattern inside of the shape, and if I double click on it, you can see I can manipulate the inside, and you can see where that actual object is inside. You can see the bounding box it's creating. Okay, and I can also change the shape of how it looks, do all kinds of really fun stuff. Okay. So these are all the different tools. You guys are going to have a lot of freedom to figure out how to use them yourselves in any way that you want to. There's so much going on. I'm sure you're going to get lost, so obviously this is going to take some time for you guys to get used to. but that's what class is for. So don't feel free to ask me to like how to combine things or how to do something that you're trying to do, and we can figure out how to use these tools to get you there. All right, so thank you for your time. I'll talk to you guys later.